So without any further ado, Bob Elder.
It is great to be here today talking to y'all. I am very grateful for the invitation from John. John, there you are, John. I'm ashamed to say the first time that I met John was today, but I've very much enjoyed talking with him and hearing about what y'all are doing here at the Pachyderm Club. I think the last time I was in the Petroleum Club was for a wedding more than 10 years ago, so it's great to be back here as well. I should say from the outset that everything that I'm going to say today about Calhoun is part of an ongoing book project, which I hope eventually will sell more books than my first book did. My editor tells me that this book will be out sometime at the end of 2019, which I told him that will happen if he'll come and teach my classes at Valparaiso for me. So I'm working on it, but this is still kind of material from the second research project. So I'm going to be talking about Calhoun, John C. Calhoun, and I'm going to do several things here. First of all, I'm going to talk about how Calhoun has been popping back up in the news and in our kind of national consciousness in the last 5 years. In very interesting ways, sometimes confusing ways, unexpected ways. Then I'll talk a little bit about Calhoun's biography, just the kind of bare facts of his life, and also a kind of very spare intellectual biography. What are the most important ideas that he's known for? And then I'll talk a little bit about how historians have approached Calhoun, interpreted Calhoun in the past, and how that is changing right now. And I hope that my book is going to be part of that shift. And I'll try to end in plenty of time to take questions here. So the most immediate point that Calhoun began popping up recently, if you are in the back, you may not be able to see, this is a monument to Calhoun in Charleston, South Carolina, in Marion Square, right in the middle of Charleston. And if you were looking from the top of this monument, this is a picture from 1907, you would be able to see Emmanuel AME Church, the church that in June of 2015, Dylan Roof entered and shot 9 people during a Bible study at that church. Emmanuel AME Church, ironically enough, is on Calhoun Street in Charleston. And amid all the other reactions that that shooting provoked, one was a direct reaction within a couple days to this monument. So a couple days after the shootings in Charleston, someone vandalized this monument. And at the base of the monument to Calhoun, which is this giant pillar, the original inscription reads, "Truth, Justice, and the Constitution." And someone added, "Truth, Justice, and the Constitution, and slavery," below that. And then below Calhoun's name in red, they wrote "racist." And what they're doing is connecting what happened at Mother Emanuel to the legacy of Calhoun. And pretty soon, this was just one incident. Pretty soon, all over the nation, people began debating Calhoun's legacy. One of the more prominent places that this debate started was at Yale University, which has, since 1933, has had a residential college named for Calhoun, who went to Yale in the early 19th century. And in 1933, they named a residential college after him, so this is one of the places at Yale where students live and eat. And a debate erupted, which it has periodically over the past 20 years, about whether or not to rename this college. And at first, the president of Yale, Peter Salovey, resisted the urges to rename Calhoun College. He said his argument was essentially we're better off not trying to erase parts of history that make us uncomfortable, but rather using them to kind of talk about and provoke discussions about that history. And so let's leave Calhoun College there. Yale spent the entire academic year of 2015 through 2016 engaging the entire student body in conversations about Calhoun College. The entire freshman class had to go through essentially a Calhoun crash course taught by history professors, because Peter Salovey's position was, before we make a decision about this, we have to know a little bit about this person. And then eventually Salovey and the board at Yale decided not to rename the college, but to name a special commission on renaming that would preside over any of these sorts of situations in the future. And the criteria that they came up with was that in considering whether or not to rename a building, they would consider what they called the primary legacy of a figure. And they decided the next year that Calhoun's primary legacy had been his defense of slavery, which we'll talk about. And on those grounds, they finally renamed Calhoun College in September of 2017 to Grace Hopper College. I don't know what they're going to do with images like this, which are literally part of the facade, the stone of the building, but they did rename the college. So he was kind of in the news for that. Maybe most interestingly, and this is a Wichita connection, is last June, a book by a Duke historian named Nancy McLean came out. And McLean's book is called Democracy in Chains: The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. I should say that this book is a very, it's very sensationalistic, it's very controversial, and the basic argument of Democracy in Chains is that Charles Koch, a figure that many of us in this room know who that is, the basic argument of the book is that Charles Koch, over the course of the last 2 to 3 decades, has employed the ideas of a famous, but to most people, obscure economist named James Buchanan, who championed something called public choice theory in the mid-20th century. And public choice theory, if I had to condense it, Russell would be much better at condensing this than I would, but public choice theory was basically the idea that because government legislation is coercive, to pass it, you need as unanimous a consent as possible so that there's broad consensus about the legitimacy of this, and that if you're going to force people to do things, there need to be options, there need to be choices. So one of the grandchildren of public choice theory could be seen as things like charter schools today, things like that. McLean's argument is that Koch founded and funded institutes all over the United States, including at places like George Mason University, in order to support these ideas, get them into the public sphere, and, in her argument, subvert democracy. And the book has been just a football. I mean, nobody's agreed on it. I think it's been a very controversial book. But in McLean's telling, where did James Buchanan, this mid-20th century economist, get his ideas about subverting democracy and, in her view, subverting majoritarian rule? Well, he got them from John C. Calhoun. So her entire first chapter is on Calhoun and his ideas, which we'll talk about. You'll see maybe the connections. And her argument is that James Buchanan and other figures picked up Calhoun's ideas, turned them into kind of economic theories, and that those have now been popularized, and that these are now the basis of what she calls the radical right in the United States. Okay. So Calhoun is, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. I could go on and on and on. There's a Lake Calhoun outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota. There's an ongoing argument about whether or not to rename that. I have a Google alert set. I'm probably the only person in the United States with a Google News alert set for John C. Calhoun. And I get multiple alerts every day because there are conversations going on all over the United States about the legacy of Calhoun and whether or not to rename things over him. I bet, other than Andrew Jackson, thanks probably to Donald Trump's comparison to Andrew Jackson, Calhoun is probably the 19th century politician who has been mentioned the most in the last year or two. So these are all things that are kind of why he's back in the news, I guess. So I'll give a brief overview of Calhoun's biography, his life, and a couple of the most important ideas before we go to kind of how historians have interpreted him. You may or may not be able to see this very well, but this is probably the best known image of Calhoun, taken in 1849, just a few months before he died. He was sick with tuberculosis. He didn't look like this most of his life, but I think this image has kind of shaped our perception of Calhoun. Calhoun was born in 1782. I always find it significant that he was born in the period when the United States is governed under the Articles of Confederation. So he is born before the Constitution, before the debate over the Constitution, before it's ratified. And among a very small subset of American politicians in Calhoun's generation, I think Calhoun had the idea of the Constitution as something that could still be tinkered with, that needed to be perfected still. Something that I don't think a lot of people have today. And I think that has to do with when he was born, the fact that he saw this process working out. Calhoun's family were Scots-Irish. They immigrated to the United States in 1933 from Ulster in Ireland. They were Presbyterians, probably involved in the linen trade in Ireland. And when times got bad, they immigrated to Pennsylvania and kept following free land down the eastern seaboard until they finally got to South Carolina in the 1750s. His father, Patrick, was a really famous, for his day, politician in South Carolina, one of the wealthiest landowners in the upstate of South Carolina. Part of the debates during the constitutional era, Patrick was involved in the debates over whether or not to ratify the U.S. Constitution after the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And Patrick was a vocal opponent of South Carolina ratifying the U.S. Constitution on the grounds that he said, in John Calhoun's memory, he said, you don't give that sort of power to an entity as far away as this new federal government. It's too much power to give to an entity that far away. Calhoun was wealthy. I mentioned that. Not as wealthy, though, as a lot of the South Carolina low-country planters that you might think of when we think of kind of the antebellum South and our images of that. The upcountry of South Carolina was a very hard-scrabble, small d democratic kind of place. And this was kind of where Calhoun grew up. Somebody realized that Calhoun had extraordinary intellectual abilities early in his life, and his brothers, after the death of his father, agreed to send him to Yale. He'd had a kind of rudimentary classical education at a school run by a Presbyterian minister in the backcountry of South Carolina. He graduated from Yale in 1804, went back to South Carolina, and immediately started a kind of meteoric rise in prominence. He's first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives during the War of 1812. He becomes known as one of the war hawks who is in favor of pushes going to war with Britain in the War of 1812. He is the Secretary of War from 1816 to 1824. He's probably one of the ironies of Calhoun's career is he's probably one of the primary figures responsible for the United States having something of a modern military when the Civil War comes around, which is then used against the South. But Calhoun probably lays the groundwork for a kind of scientific approach to the military during his tenure there. He's then vice president under two very different presidents, John Quincy Adams first, and then Andrew Jackson. And I think it's a sign of Calhoun's kind of stature and national standing that he is vice president under both of those figures. Although and we'll come back to this, he doesn't get along with Jackson very well. I think it's an understatement to say that. Supposedly, when Andrew Jackson died, some of his last words were, "I should have hung John C. Calhoun." And it actually sounds like something Jackson would say, so I don't doubt that story. When Calhoun resigns from being vice president during the Nullification crisis of 1832 to 1833, which we'll talk a little bit about, South Carolina immediately elects him senator. And he serves in the U.S. Senate until his death in 1850 with the brief interlude as Secretary of State during John Tyler's administration, so in the 1840s. And Calhoun dies in 1850, in March of 1850, right at the kind of in the critical period when the Union is starting to unravel. And he's been alternately blamed for the Civil War and for and other people who believe that if he had lived, he might have been able to prevent the Civil War. But historians don't usually deal in hypotheticals like that. So Calhoun is mainly known for two, if I had to pick two central ideas or contributions that Calhoun is known for. One of them would be, I know you can't read this, I'm going to read it. One of them would be the crucial role that he plays in the Senate during the 1830s in committing the South to what was a new position about slavery in the 1830s. And this is famously summed up in Calhoun's speech on the floor of the U.S. Senate in 1837 when he declares slavery not only a necessary evil, but a positive good in a democratic society. So the context of this is that there had been increasing numbers of abolitionist petitions to Congress and the Senate in the 1830s. And Calhoun's position was that Congress shouldn't even accept these petitions. They should be immediately tabled, not discussed. This was too dangerous of a proposition. And the historical position of many Southerners had been something like Thomas Jefferson's position on slavery, which was, yes, slavery is not a good thing. It's an evil, but it's one that we can't easily do without doing damage both to our own economy and to the well-being of the enslaved themselves. So it's a conundrum. Jefferson famously said, we have the tiger by the tail, and we can neither let him go nor hang on with any safety. And Calhoun becomes dissatisfied with this position. He doesn't think it's strong enough. And so in this famous speech in 1837, he says, and I'm just going to read parts of it here. He says, "But I take higher ground. I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. I hold then that there never has yet existed a wealthy and civilized society in which one portion of the community did not, in point of fact, live on the labor of the other. Broad and general as is this assertion, it is fully borne out by history. This is not the proper occasion, but if it were, it would not be difficult to trace the various devices by which the wealth of all civilized communities has been so unequally divided, and to show by what means so small a share has been allotted to those by whose labor it was produced, and so large a share given to the non-producing classes. The devices are almost innumerable, from the brute force and gross superstition of ancient times to the subtle and artful fiscal contrivances of the modern. I might well challenge a comparison between them and the more direct, simple, and patriarchal mode by which the labor of the African race is among us commanded by the European. And he goes on to make comparisons between industrial laboring classes and the slaves of the South, making the point that slaves have it better than the industrial laboring classes of England and the North. Then at the end he says, but I will not dwell on this aspect of the question. I turn to the political, and here I fearlessly assert that the existing relation between the two races in the South, against which these blind fanatics are waging war, forms the most solid and durable foundation on which to rear free and stable political institutions. It is useless to disguise the fact. There is always and always has been, in an advanced stage of wealth and civilization, a conflict between labor and capital. The condition of society in the South exempts us from the disorders and dangers resulting from this conflict, and this explains why it is that the political condition of the slaveholding states has been so much more stable and quiet than that of the North. Now, there's several really important things going on in this. Some historians have pointed to the fact that in this speech, Calhoun is using categories that Karl Marx will use 10 years later in the Communist Manifesto. He's talking about the conflict between labor and capital. He's even, and this is why Marxist historians are frequently fascinated by Calhoun, he seems to acknowledge this point that Marx and others would be arguing in the 19th century, which is that the non-producing classes, right, the bourgeois in Marxist terms, essentially appropriate the labor of the producing classes. Calhoun seems to say, yeah, of course that happens. It's always happened, and we just disguise it now. So why disguise it is Calhoun's radical, really incredibly radical argument. Why disguise it? Let's just acknowledge it and acknowledge that actually slavery is a better way of managing the relationship between labor and capital, because it unites the interests of labor and capital together in the person of the planter. And we don't have this conflict that in the 1830s Calhoun and others were seeing in the industrial capitalistic economies of the North or England. So he's essentially just saying, this is a better way to manage this relationship. And obviously, it's based on this root assumption of race. But he's also saying near the end, right, that this is a better way to build a democratic society, he's saying. Calhoun is often accused of being anti-democratic. This is one of Nancy McLean's central arguments. And I don't think that's true at all. I think Calhoun was intensely democratic, but he had his own somewhat illiberal vision of democracy. He believed passionately in white democracy, and he thought that white democracy in the United States depended on slavery. These ideas were so radical that when Calhoun made this speech in the Senate, some of his Southern colleagues leapt to their feet to say, hey, we don't actually agree with this. This is going too far for us. Right? We still hold to the old necessary evil argument. But it's also undoubtedly true that by the 1850s, Calhoun's argument was the majority common argument that most white Southerners believed in. And so in some ways, by committing white Southerners to this a vision of slavery as a positive good, you could lay some of the blame for the Civil War on Calhoun, because once white Southerners are committed to that vision, there's not much room for negotiation with something like abolition. There's no room for gradual emancipation, which was the path that Great Britain took. If you're committed to a vision of slavery as a positive good, you're not going to be willing to negotiate it at all. The other, and just as important, this is why I somewhat disagree with Yale and their idea that Calhoun's primary legacy is his defense of slavery. I think it may be one of his primary legacies, if there can be more than one. The other one is Calhoun's ideas about the relationship between states and the federal government, which get embodied in his arguments about nullification, and then at the end of his career, the idea of the concurrent majority. So in the nullification crisis, which happens in 1832, this is the break between Andrew Jackson and Calhoun. Calhoun was Jackson's vice president. Most Southerners thought that Andrew Jackson was a kind of pro-states' rights president. And in 1828, Congress passes a new tariff, right, a new import tax. And the idea behind the tariff of 1828 was to encourage northern manufacturing. So they taxed the sorts of manufactured goods that you could get from England, but that were also being produced in northern factories, things like cotton textiles, shoes, wool, other manufactured goods. The tariff quickly became known as the Tariff of Abominations by Southerners. And their position was that constitutionally, any form of taxation has to apply equally to all different parts of the country. There's a clause in the Constitution, right, which says any form of taxation levied by Congress has to be equal across in its effects. And the argument of many Southerners like Calhoun is that the effects of the 1828 tariff were not equal. And they were not being used simply for revenue, which they believed was a constitutional use of tariffs. Instead, they were being used to prop up certain industries, to kind of pick winners and losers, if you want to use our kind of current terminology. And Calhoun's answer to this came in the form of this doctrine of nullification, which he elaborates first in an 1828 document called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, and then in 1831 in something called the Fort Hill Address. And the basic idea of nullification, which many of us have heard of and are probably familiar with, right, is the idea that a state can interpose itself between its citizens and the federal government in the case of an unconstitutional law. And to get this idea, Calhoun harked back to two documents from 1798, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which had been written by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson in the midst of a conflict with the John Adams administration. The Adams administration had passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which suppressed free speech, and Jefferson and Madison had responded with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, saying that a state could, in their view, a state could interpose itself. Jefferson actually, in the Kentucky resolution, used the word nullification, but the Kentucky legislature took it out. They thought that was a little too radical. But Calhoun harks back to those documents and brings them into the current context and argues that states can interpose themselves between their people and the federal government. And this would trigger in Calhoun's thinking a constitutional, it would be a crisis, but a constitutional convention in which each state would decide whether or not this state's protest was legitimate or not. So in essence, it would trigger a whole new round of what happened in 1787 through 1789. And you would decide based on how many states were in favor or against, whether this was constitutional, and then you would go on down the road. So in the Fort Hill Address in 1831, he says, "The great and leading principle is that the general government emanated from the people of the several states, forming distinct political communities and acting in their separate and sovereign capacity, and not from all the people forming one aggregate political community. That the Constitution of the United States is in fact a compact," a word that was really important to Calhoun, "to which each state is a party in the character already described, and that the several states or parties have a right to judge of its infractions, and in case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of power not delegated, they have the right, in the last resort, to use the language of the Virginia resolutions to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them." And he says, you can call this whatever you want, state right veto, nullification, any other name, but he says this is a fundamental principle of our Constitution. Now, Calhoun believed, some people thought this was a crazy idea. John Quincy Adams called nullification the most pernicious political doctrine ever introduced in his lifetime. Now, the Adams were prone to overstating things like this, but he did honestly believe this was a dangerous political doctrine. Calhoun thought that nullification was essential to maintaining the Union. That this was the only way that states would be able to be confident enough to stay in the Union. Because Calhoun also believed that in the end, states have a right to secede. And so only a mechanism like nullification would allow this to somehow be worked out. Calhoun develops this idea over the rest of his life, and it's probably best expressed in his Disquisition on Government, which is published after his death in 1850. And in Disquisition on Government, this becomes the idea of the concurrent majority. And basically, the idea that Calhoun expresses in the Disquisition on Government is that it's a mistake to think about any form of government, especially democracies, as operating on the principle of numerical majorities. He says there's two kinds of majorities. There's a numerical majority and what he calls a concurrent majority. And he says, if you operate your democracy on the basis of a numerical majority, well, you're going to get tyranny. Somebody's going to get squashed. The minority, in his view, slaveholders in his own era, the minority is going to get the short end of the stick eventually if you operate on the principle of the numerical majority. So instead of that, Calhoun says we need to think of society as separated out into interests. There are different groups that constitute different interests in a society. And each of those interests, Calhoun says, should have a veto power, ultimate veto over any form of legislation that's on the table. And in Calhoun's view, this would assure that nobody even proposes any legislation that's not in the common interest, because they know that whoever's interest it is not in will veto it. So he views this as kind of purifying the political system, not making people coalesce into huge political parties that try to beat each other up in order to get numerical majorities and then pass their legislation over the objections of the other party. Other people pointed out that this might be a recipe for total government paralysis. Calhoun gave lots of examples, like he said jury trials, juries operate this way. Interestingly, he used the example of the Polish parliament, which not many people probably knew anything about in 1850. And he said, look at how the 5 civilized tribes, the Iroquois nations, decide things. They have to be perfectly unanimous before they can go forward. The concurrent majority has been debated ever since much more by political scientists, I think, than by historians, but it's definitely one of Calhoun's most important contributions. Okay. So Calhoun dies in 1850, and over the next decade, a lot of his ideas, especially the idea of nullification and the idea that the states are a sovereign unit, and the logical endpoint of that is secession. Calhoun himself is not a secessionist in the sense that he doesn't advocate secession, but his ideas are weaponized in the 1850s by other Southerners who are, and it is Calhoun's ideas, I think, that are partly responsible for secession in the Civil War. My favorite story about this is an image of Calhoun's grave in Charleston. And in 1865, the poet Walt Whitman was sitting in a hospital in Washington, D.C., and he overheard two Union soldiers talking. And one Union soldier said to the other, "I've been in Charleston, I just came from Charleston, and I saw Calhoun's monument," by which he meant this tomb, not the monument that we started with. And the other soldier said, "No, you haven't seen Calhoun's monument. I've seen Calhoun's monument." Calhoun's monument is the entire South ravaged and destroyed, a whole generation of young men dead on the field, and the very people that he didn't think deserved freedom freed. That's Calhoun's monument. And I think in some ways this has been one of the verdicts of a lot of historians on Calhoun. So I'll just give two quick examples and just talk about how historians see him, how that's changing, and then I'm done. So in 1947, Richard Hofstadter wrote really a wonderful essay on Calhoun, but took a pretty negative view of him, I think. Hofstadter, whose essay is called "The Marks of the Master Class," said Calhoun was a minority spokesman in a democracy, a particularist in an age of nationalism, a slaveholder in an age of advancing liberties, and an agrarian in a furiously capitalistic country. Quite understandably, he developed a certain perversity of mind. This one's much more recent. The last biography of Calhoun in 1993, the historian Irving Bartlett said, "The dominant tendencies of the Western world move toward human liberty, equality, and nationality, and Calhoun, frozen in time in tiny South Carolina, seemed to defy them all." My own favorite negative assessment of Calhoun is from the historian David Potter, who once said that Calhoun was the most majestic champion of error since Milton's Satan. Which is if you know Milton, that's sort of a compliment, but Satan is a very interesting figure in Milton, but not really. But not a positive assessment. Now, I don't think historians are not, in general, moving towards a kind of defense or positive assessment of Calhoun, I think. But what is undeniable, I think, right now is how important Calhoun and his ideas still are. So you may not be able to see these, but these are examples of books that have come out just in the last, I think the oldest one of these is probably 3 years old, that have provoked, I think, a total reassessment of kind of Calhoun's importance and context. And I'm just going to make 2 points about these. The first one is that it used to be a common interpretation to see Calhoun as representing the entire South as a kind of backwards-looking, reactionary, being drug into the modern era, kicking and screaming force. And this has to do with slavery, of course, which most people saw as a fundamentally pre-modern, pre-capitalistic form of labor. And in the last couple years, historians have been kind of overturning that interpretation and showing how slavery in the South is connected to the rise of global capitalism. So some of these books describe how slaves and slavery and the expansion of slavery in the South is financed by banks in the North and in England, And of course, the cotton is being exported to the north and to cotton mills in Manchester, England. And cotton is the fundamental, it is the quintessential engine and material of the Industrial Revolution in England. So, and they're showing how the practice of slavery in the South is itself run in many cases according to kind of capitalistic notions of efficiency and value and those sorts of things. So what does this mean? Well, instead of Calhoun looking like a kind of backwards-looking defender of an outmoded regime of labor, kind of placing his hand and saying stop against the flow of history, I think now Calhoun looks much more like a someone who's facing domestic headwinds of abolitionism at home. But if you look at Calhoun and the South from an international perspective, he's mounting a defense of a vital hub of global capitalism that cotton manufacturers in places like England were terrified of losing. And so it makes the story much less simple and binary, I think. The old interpretation of the Civil War was a modern capitalistic North. It goes to war with a pre-capitalist agrarian South. And that I don't think we can really say that anymore. So Calhoun looks very different in that regard. The other one is, so let's see, I'm going to skip to this one. The other one is a reconsideration of secession. Now, Calhoun's ideas do lend themselves to secession, I said. I think in an American context, we usually think of secession rightly as a kind of self-obviously wrong idea, an idea that's been tried, failed, and should never be tried again, right? Because of our own history, right? Our own history of the Civil War. We know that 750,000 people died, at least, the last time this was tried, right? So unless, I used to say maybe Texas will try it, and I think maybe if Donald Trump wins again, maybe California will try it. We'll see. But in an international context, this simply isn't true. The Civil War, instead of being the end of secession in the modern world, the Civil War is really the beginning of secession in the modern world. The Harvard historian David Armitage calculated that since 1816, there have been roughly 500 wars in the world. And of those, 109 have been fought about the issue of secession. So nearly 100 wars since around the time of the Civil War have been fought by states trying to establish an independent identity. And instead of seeing Calhoun as kind of the father of this kind of failed philosophy, nullification and secession, I think instead, whatever you think of it, for better or worse, Calhoun instead now looks like maybe one of the first figures in modern history to think about the question of how you can unmake a nation state, which is a new creation, right? The United States is one of the first modern nation states, and one of the fundamental questions about these is, how do you unmake them? Can they be unmade, and by what means could they be unmade, if so? And political scientists and philosophers now are engaged in this question, which they now call political divorce. And we're seeing this. I use this one. If you can't see this, this is graffiti that says Catalonia is not Spain. Catalonia has voted to secede from Spain twice in the last year. And just this week, they re-elected the ousted regional president who had presided over the secession process and provoked now an ongoing constitutional crisis in Spain. And we can just think of Scotland and Brexit and all these other issues where this is not a dead issue in our society. So like it or not, I think we're stuck with John C. Calhoun for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much. I'll take questions.
What difference do you see between this concurrent union and a constitutional republic, of which our governments aren't paying attention to?
You mean the concurrent majority and a constitutional republic?
You said it was four.
The concurrent majority.
And a constitutional republic to me is one and almost the same thing.
Well, this is a great question. Calhoun thought that the principle of the concurrent majority was actually embedded in the Constitution. So he thought that his interpretation of the Constitution is that it's mostly a negative document concerned with restraining power. And in his view, that's what the concurrent majority was, that a minority interest should have veto power over the majority. So he just thought that the Constitution needed to be perfected in that regard. So he didn't think it was wrong. His view was that this concurrent majority principle was already there, it just needed to be strengthened, if that makes sense. One mechanism that he suggested in his own time was maybe there should be a northern and a southern president, each with veto power.
A question and a quick comment. John C. Calhoun was first elected to Congress in 1810 and was a nationalist and during the War of 1812 war hawk and a strong opponent of what became the Hartford Convention effort that could arguably said that was an effort to secede by the New England states at that time at that approach. Isn't it fair to say that Calhoun's position, regardless of his odious support for slavery throughout his career, on this issue, on the nationalist issue, that he actually flip-flopped and did a 180 politically while he was serving in public office? My quick comment also, I had the opportunity to meet F.A. Hayek, and I would say that he had more of an intellectual impact on James Buchanan, as well as the rest of the Nobel laureates out of Chicago, just mentioning Friedman, Stigler, Coase, there's others who would escape my mind at the moment, than the idiocy of that professor down at Duke. So I appreciate your comments on flip-flop.
Yeah. You're making a critique of McLean's book that I think a lot of historians and economists have made. I can't speak to her other argument, but it seems to me the link between Calhoun and Buchanan is very tenuous at best, from what I can tell. On your first, so the accusation of the flip-flop, which even in the 19th century, right, this was an explosive accusation. Yes, it's true that Calhoun is much more nationalistic in the early phases of his career than he is later. His explanation of that, accepted or not, is that these are two very different contexts. That in the early part of his career, the country was facing a situation where they literally could have been blotted out of existence by Great Britain. And that in that context, he was a strong nationalist. He supported a strong navy. He opposed the Hartford Convention, the first where secession actually first surfaces in. And then later, Calhoun's view is that by the end of his career, he says the dangers now are different. We need a different. Our system can adapt to both, but we need emphasis in different places of the system to protect states' rights later in his career. Now, Calhoun never would have acknowledged, he never said he was wrong. He would not, never. I mean, most politicians won't, but Calhoun seems constitutionally incapable of admitting that. I do think there's more to the flip-flop than Calhoun himself said, but it's also true. I mean, I think you also have to grant his argument that there are different contexts going on. Does that sort of help? This is a biographer trying to be fair to the subject and also...
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I'm not the one who usually carries the mic. There is a saying that if you don't observe history, you're bound to repeat it. So what's your comment, this is going a little afield maybe, about tearing down the statues and destroying them? There was no Holocaust, and I'm concerned about our history books and so on and so forth.
So I think the statue question is such an interesting one. my first thing is I don't think there's a principle that fits I think it would actually be a mistake to say there's one principle that should fit all of this stuff, right? What I really liked about what Yale did, at least at first, was they said they resisted the impulse to just tear it down and rename it instantly, right? And I think that's the only part of the whole thing that I really don't like as a historian. It gives me pause is the episodes where governments have kind of just taken these statues down in the middle of the night. I think there should be robust public conversations about these statues. And what I liked that Yale did was they said, okay, before, initially, right, they said before you call for this to be renamed, before it comes down, you have to actually learn about this person. So when a historian at Yale, David Blight, gave a lecture where he went through all of Calhoun's accomplishments, his long record of public service, and said, look, we have to know all about this before we can even talk about whether or not to take this down. I think and I think Yale is a good case because it's a residential hall. I would be really sorry if they took down the statue in Charleston. The residential hall, I once had dinner in a house in South Carolina, in Edgefield, South Carolina, in the dining room, and there was a giant picture of Calhoun in the dining room right over the table. And our hostess apologized for this. She said, this was here when we bought the house, and it's so important, I just don't feel like I can take it down. And I ate dinner with Calhoun, basically that figure kind of looking down at me the whole time. And it gave me a little bit of sympathy for the students in Calhoun College, having to kind of eat under that presence all the time. But I think the important thing is that Yale's process in the beginning was a kind of democratic process that involved education and debate about it. But I think it should be left up to local jurisdictions.
My name is Joseph Elmore, and my parents grew up in Calhoun, Louisiana. And you've given me an insight as to maybe where that came from.
I would bet.
And I just want to say that I believe in history, and I believe it's part of God's plan, so I wouldn't be here without slavery. And we have to kind of understand that. You know, not to necessarily agree with it or, be a supporter of it, but understand that it's part of God's plan, and we should appreciate that part of it.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, I think that's the argument, right, for keeping these statues and things up, which as a historian is one I'm really sympathetic to, which is if we take all these down, then we're losing, as a teacher, my reaction is we're losing these incredible opportunities for discussion, right? The fact that you can go to Charleston, South Carolina and have Calhoun's statue right there in the square and basically look across the street and see Emmanuel AME Church and understand the kind of drama of that juxtaposition would be, it would be a real shame to lose that, I think.
Since I think this is going to be a real interesting question, one of our guests asked a question, Bob Love.
Do you think that there is importance to the fact that Martin Luther King began by observing and opposing racism, progressed into seeing a bigger problem of economic exploitation and poverty, and pretty much ended in opposition to war, and for that he was pretty much assassinated? Is his progression there, is his growth from racism to something broader, to poverty, to something causing both war, significant, as you would compare him in his ideological development to someone like Calhoun?
Well, I mean, Calhoun, there's a couple things. I mean, first of all, Calhoun certainly develops as well. maybe in the opposite direction. I'm not sure. But I think one interesting thing is that Martin Luther King evolves in the sense that he comes to see that you can't deal, in his view, you can't deal with racism and racial problems, whatever those are. He sees that those are intertwined with economics, right? And whatever your side spectrum of politics you're on, I think you can probably acknowledge that in different ways race is intertwined with economics. Race and class closely correlate in this country. And I think Calhoun is a thinker in the 19th century who already realized in very different ways than King that those two things were intimately linked, right? His 1837 speech, he's saying, look, if you're opposing slavery, then let's talk about the larger system of which slavery is a part of, right? In his view, you're never going to get rid of this system. This inequality between classes is something that's always going to be there. It's always been there. We just have to figure out how to arrange it in the most beneficial way for both of them. And in his view, right, that's slavery. Now, where Calhoun didn't go with that is, well, then why not enslave all the poor white people as well, right? And there are other thinkers in the South, like George Fitzhugh, who actually go that far and say, hey, actually, this would be great for everybody.
Let's thank Bob Elder.